Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Focus on Christ podcast, episode 7. I'm so thankful you're here today and you've decided to join us. There's a couple administrative things I want to cover real quick with you. If you want to hop on over to, when this podcast is over, just hop on over to Facebook and like our page, Focus on Christ, and then hop on over to Instagram and like our Instagram page there. The reason you want to do that is so you can stay current with updates. Every time we release something new or I have a new piece of content comes out, it goes on our Facebook group first. So you want to make sure you're a part of that community. And I try and send something inspirational every single day, either on Instagram or on Facebook Lives or both, to keep you inspired and to keep you motivated and to help you stay focused on Christ in your daily Christian walk. I know how important that is to you, and I just want to help encourage you in any way that I can. So, like I said, today is episode number 7. We're going to be talking a little bit more from the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, a book by John C. Maxwell, and we're going to be looking at it from a biblical perspective. How do the principles that he talks about in this book, how do they play out in the Bible? What are the biblical examples that we can look at and look to try and develop our leadership and improve it? So today is the law of solid ground. The law of solid ground is that trust is the foundation of leadership. So it's the law of solid ground. It's trust is the foundation of leadership. So I shared with you, I think it was in the last episode or the episode before that, about the time that I violated trust with one of my, it was a platoon, one of my groups of soldiers that I was over while I was in a training environment because of how I was observing them and what I was thinking, and I was letting my personal needs get in the way of the fulfillment of the team's mission and their needs. And that's not how you want to operate as a leader, obviously. And I know you'll do better than I did. But I shared that story with you and one of the other laws. And so you'll find that a lot of these laws have overlapping components that so that they integrate well together. They're not looked at in isolation. Yes, you can have a failure in a particular law that causes you to have a lot of struggles in your leadership. And typically we all have blind spots. We all have things that we are not good at, that we just kind of have to surround ourselves with people that are strong in those areas to compensate for that. However, when we do things where we violate people's trust, it is super hard to regain. And I used to be of the philosophy that once trust is lost, it can never be regained. And some people advocate that, and there is an element of truth to that. If you think back through, if you've been in a relationship and there's been adultery in that, or if you were in the dating environment and you were cheated on, then you understand how difficult it can be to trust anyone again, let alone the person that violated your trust. And while that's a super intimate environment and a very close relationship for most people when that happens, the same thing happens in leadership. You, as a leader, you are trying to learn about your people. You're trying to get them, know them on a personal level. You're trying to build relationships so that you can have better communication, better connectivity, and so that the team can be lifted higher as a result. So while the intimacy looks different in a romantic environment, it is very similar when that trust is violated. And I know that you have examples in your life of when people have violated your trust and it was just devastating. The relationship never was able to recover. And so we're going to go through some things about the law of solid ground, and the kind of the slogan on it is leadership operates on a basis of trust. So we're going to start in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1 through 22. 1 Samuel 24, verses 1 through 22. So it's going to be 1 Samuel 24, 1 through 22. And this is a story about one of the times when David has the opportunity. King David, he had been anointed king, and he was, but he wasn't king yet. And Saul was pursuing him, trying to kill him. And this was one of the opportunities that he had to kill King Saul, and he chose not to. So we're going to read through this. Now it happened when Saul returned from following the Philistines that it was told to him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness of En Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men at the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart was troubled him, because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." So David restrained his servants with these words, and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. We see in this situation here that David has been on the run for quite some time. He has been hiding out with with a few select men of his, and he's been running in fear for his life from Saul. And Saul comes into this cave, and just in my imagination, this had to be a huge cave. I mean, a really huge cave. And he came in there to take care of his personal business, and David crawled up, and we don't know the exact situation here, whether Saul had put his cloak down and David went to the cloak, or whether he was wearing the cloak and David cut it off the corner of his garment off of the cloak while he was wearing it. We don't know. It's it's a really, really neat and powerful story. And he has the opportunity there to kill Saul. And then his men want to kill Saul as well. They've been in hiding for all this time. And it's just a great opportunity for David to take Saul's life and end this portion of misery in his life. He chooses not to, though, and he is modeling behavior for his men. So he has chosen to respect and honor God's appointed man, even though this man is causing him tremendous amounts of grief and agony, and he's trying to kill him and take his life. However, David has chosen to say, "I will respect God's appointment over my personal desires." And so David is modeling this for his men. In our lives, it's so easy for us to seek revenge and seek retribution and to try to find ways to make things right in our own eyes. And it's important that not only do we model behavior for the people that we are under us, but we also model this type of behavior for our families, for our kids. They're going to do whatever we do, usually at 50% as well, which is how people do. They do about 50% of what you say and show. And so we have to be, no matter where you're at and where you are a leader, whether it be you're a leader in your home, you're a leader in your church, you're a leader for your team, your organization, or just being a leader in life, where you go through life and you set the right example and you seek ways to help people and to show them a better way. So let's go ahead and pick up in verse 8. It says, "David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, 'My lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you. But my eye spared you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see. Yes, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog? A flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. So you see here, and that took us down through verse 15. You're seeing here this story play out where David goes out and he confronts Saul, and he challenges him with the question of, why are you pursuing me? Why do you listen to the people that say I am inciting rebellion and seeking your life? If I truly wanted your life, if I truly had an animosity for you and your kingdom, I would have taken your life now. So we're talking about the law of solid ground and how leadership operates on this basis of trust. And in his own way, David is trying to establish that law with Saul at this point to rebuild that trust where David used to work in the palace for Saul and there was mutual respect and trust going back and forth. Now we know that the Lord has put a particular spirit upon Saul, they call it a evil spirit. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but Saul was tormented, and then David would play the music, play his harp for him, and calm him down. And then King Saul threw his spear at him several times, and but David always got away because the spirit of the Lord with David is much different. It's protecting him and keeping him. So we see these stories playing out here, and we can see the story of solid ground and how trust is being built. David is building trust with his men to trust in God. David is building trust in his men to trust him to make the right decision, even when it's much easier to make the wrong decision. And then can see trust being built out between David and Saul, as David is while Saul is the leader that's up here, David's the leader down here, but David's taking the time to try and reestablish and build trust and build it back up. So just because you're the leader at the high level doesn't mean trust can't be established from the lower level as well. So if you're in a position where you might be at a lower level than, say, the person that's not being what you might call a good leader, that doesn't mean you can't establish trust upwards and build out that law of solid ground for you and your team, because everybody around you will recognize that in the end. They'll begin to see that playing out. We're going to go ahead and read 16 through 22, so 16 through the end of the chapter. It said, So it was, when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Then he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be the king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. So David swore to Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So we're seeing how this story plays out and how Saul recognizes the strength of David's leadership. And he interestingly enough, he makes him take an oath at this point that we will see will get David in trouble later in his life, and it causes some interesting challenges for the kingdom of Israel, because Saul's legacy is not a great legacy. And David makes this oath with him without consulting God, and that's kind of there you don't see a lot of that mentioned in the Bible, but as I was reading through this with you today, you see this decision that David made, and he chose not to consult God when he made this decision. And as a consequence, there's this storyline that plays out later in history because of David's choice here. We're going to see some of that. I think we've covered some of that in past episodes where we've talked about some of the things that happened because with Mephibosheth and how David was trying to honor the last of Saul's legacy. So there's all sorts of interesting things playing out here. But you can see that Saul is definitely recognizing King David's superior leadership. And it's because of actions like David just took in the cave that make him that superior leader. So we're going to go over to Esther 7. So Esther 7, verses 1 through 10. And this is a story of Haman, Mordecai, and Esther. So Esther 7, 1 through 10. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy would never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from his banquet and wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from his palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing in the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. In case you don't remember the story, I'll recap it very quickly. We see that Haman had a deep hatred for the Jews and for Mordecai in particular, and he built this set of gallows that was 50 cubits high so that he could hang Mordecai on it. And he sent out the proclamation throughout all the land that the Jews would be killed on a certain day, and just all these things were set in place by Haman to destroy the Jews because he hated the Jews. Well, Esther was married to the king and was found in great favor with the king. So he literally offered her up to half of his kingdom if she would just request it. And so we see we see how much love he had for Queen Esther. And Mordecai was to be hanged on these gallows because he was a Jew and he offended Haman. And Esther was a Jew. And so as part of Haman's evil plot, Queen Esther's life was forfeit. She was going to be killed. And the king did not know this. My understanding is he didn't know that Queen Esther was a Jew. But Haman did. And so Haman contrived this whole plan, and then it kind of backfired on him, as you can see here. And so you can see the difference in how Esther and Mordecai built their lives on a much more solid ground of trust and respect and honor, and their leadership styles were much, much better and stronger than those of Haman. Haman had he had no integrity. He had no trust with the king. You can see the when Queen Esther proposed this to the king, that the king didn't even blink. He immediately took Esther's word over Haman's word. And so you have to ask yourself, if you're in a leadership position and somebody comes to you with a challenge or a confrontation or a situation, you typically will look at it from both sides. That's not what the king did. The king immediately recognized that Esther had lived her life on a ground of much more solid trust than what Haman had, and he immediately took Esther's side over Haman's. From the text, we don't see that there's any back and forth. There's no questioning of what she said. It was just, Haman, you're done. And we see that that's what happened. One of the eunuchs went out there and took care of that. Well, Haman was eventually hanged on the gallows. We don't know who did that. And then we see through the story, if you read the entire book of Esther, you'll see how Mordecai also had a much more significant level of trust, and he was eventually granted a lot of respect from the king because he had built his leadership on a foundation of trust and honor and respect, versus Haman built his on his personal wealth and his popularity and his arrogance and his greed and a lot of attributes that would not be favorable in a leader. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 22. We're going to look at a little bit of stuff out of the New Testament here. Matthew 22. And we're going to start in verse 15. So Matthew 22, starting in verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. So we're talking, this is a confrontation between Christ and the Pharisees. And they sent him, we'll start over. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth. Nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the money, tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. One of the character traits that we see that's being modeled here by Christ, that everybody in the world at that time recognized, these were the Pharisees. These were think of them as the law keepers. They were the rule keepers. They were the ones that were supposed to have the highest knowledge of the law and know how to interpret it and to implement it so that you could be, quote, sin-free and to avoid breaking God's law. And we see, it says in here, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth. Nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. As even the Pharisees had a high level of trust and respect for Christ, because one of the things he did here he was recognized as modeling, as that he could look at an individual and see them as an individual, not as a black. Today we would say, well, they're black, or they're white, or they're Hispanic, or they're Asian, or they're whatever. And when Christ looked at a person, he didn't see those labels. He saw the individual. We see that when, he's very well recognized for hanging out with the tax tax collectors, the sinners, the prostitutes, the harlots, just everybody that's we would normally judge. So in our society today, that might be people that are a different culture than we are, whether that be a black culture or an Asian culture or a European culture or maybe it's a third world country culture where everything is just nasty, dirty, and we begin to judge people. Maybe it's the homeless in our community where we have judgment against them when we see them because we can't see them through Christ's eyes. We can't see Christ in them for whatever reason. And so Jesus is modeling, he is modeling that behavior, and because of the ability to see people who they are instead of what they are, he has built trust with these Pharisees to the point that they call that trait out, and then they recognize them saying, we get it. Whatever you say is going to be, it means something. And in verse 22 it says, when they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. There was no rebuttal. They just recognized his authority was very unique and very special. We're picking up in verse 23. The same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he'd married, and leaving no offspring to his wife, to his brother, and leaving no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second, and also the third, and even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman dies. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they are all had her. So this is a group of very highly educated, very religious Jews at the time, and they were challenging Christ on a nuance of the law from the Old Testament, and that talked about how a Jew was to take care of the wife of their brother when their brother died, and in order to perpetuate the name of that family and to ensure that family was not wiped off the face of the earth. And so they're challenging him on some nuances of that. And Jesus answered them and said to them, You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they will neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what is spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So again, you can see that the Sadducees have come to him as a teacher. So teacher back then had a very special connotation. It was somebody that had gone out and they were a lot of times it was a rabbi in nature, and then they had a following. They had disciples that were following him. So they recognized him as a leader and as a teacher. It's interesting how he responds to them with this in this passage that just challenging the very premise of their thought about God is not a God of the dead, but a God of the living, and how these nuances of the old law are not what are important in the new kingdom. I think that's really a really good point to dive into just a little bit. So many times it is really easy as a leader to get bogged down in the nuances of the rules and the processes and the procedures, and to really hold your people's feet to the fire, so to speak, concerning those things, those protocols and those procedures, and how violations of them cause the team to not move forward, and so on and so forth. And you'll notice as you read through the New Testament that while some of the rules are important to Christ, and there are some commandments that are very, we consider very sacred, there's a lot of things in there that Jesus never nitpicked about the details. He always led from a higher position. And so, as a leader, we want to make sure that we lead from a higher position so that we can have that trust and we can establish that. And this here so we talked about the Pharisees, and this is the Sadducees, so it's an entirely different group of Jews. These two didn't cross over, they didn't like each other very well, and they would often fight and squabble and bicker over different aspects of the law. And we still see that, and when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So there was some very, he just had that, he just was standing on that solid ground. He had a high level of respect and trust with the people. We're going to pick up in verse 34. And it says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, saying, 'Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets.'" This is one of my favorite passages, and it's kind of one of those marching orders for me. We see these two commandments were given in the Old Testament before the Ten Commandments came down. So if you're looking at things from kind of a hierarchical perspective, we have the New Testament, and then we have the Old Law, and then we have these two commandments on top of that. And these are just, they mean a lot to me, because when Christ says, "What are the greatest commandments?" those are my marching orders. Those are the things things that I hold closest to me. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. The second is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If I can get those two things right in my life, then I feel that I am on much more solid ground. If I can do those two things, then I can build trust and respect and a relationship with people. I can have my communication with them, my heart towards them, all those things will be so much better. And I will be able to build that basis of trust. 41 through 44, or 45 rather. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstools'? If David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare question him anymore. I'm not really going to get into the nuances of this, but at the end of the day, he's asking them, David recognizes me as Lord. You recognize David as king in the lineage of the Christ, but you don't recognize and respect me. And so it's, at a different type of level. So he's really challenging them at this point. He's challenging their entire theology with when he asks them this question. And it just goes to show you how much trust and respect that he had with these crowds, that he could do that. And they said from that day forward, not anyone dared question him. It's just kind of really interesting that he had such integrity and he was on such solid ground, and his words were so uncontestable with him, and he had such respect and trust that they weren't willing to challenge him anymore. We're going to slide right over to Matthew 23 and look at a little bit of a contrast of what this should look like. So we're going to look at Matthew 23 and verse 13, starting in verse 13. It says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. And when he is won, you make him twice as much the son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple does nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar does nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it. This is really such a contrast of the behavior that we see from the Pharisees and the behaviors that we have just talked about being coming to us from Christ. It is we see all the things that the Pharisees do that are backwards in the way of leadership. They actually undermine and create more problems in their leadership. They create obstacles to people moving forward. They put in place obstacles to prevent people from growing and becoming what they're supposed to be and who they can become. Just so many things that they are doing to create obstacles in people's life. And then they set up this series of rules and behaviors to... Initially, kind of the idea sounds good, that you want these rules and procedures in place to help keep you from a path of sin. In the end, though, they were actually impediments to people developing a closer relationship with Christ. That's really when I phrase it like that, it really brings home the point of what I'm trying to do here at Focus on Christ. Here at Focus on Christ, I'm trying to help you to develop your leadership, your self-leadership, and leadership within your organizations from a Christian perspective. I'm trying to help you to put Christ at the center of your life, not to give you more rules and processes to do on your daily basis. Rather, it is to help you to guide your mind so that your mind stays on Christ. Because what the Pharisees have done here is they've taken everybody's mind off of God, and they've put it on the rules and the procedures and the policies and all those things. And here at Focus on Christ, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you back simple and easy techniques and processes so that your eyes will always stay on Christ. It's not about, if I am helping you to develop some morning rituals, it's not about the going through the mantras for the rituals if those rituals don't point you back to Christ. The idea is to point you to Christ. So if it ever becomes that the ritual is more important than the service to Christ and your worship to God, then it's obviously not working for you, and you have to find a new and a better way. And that's what I think that's what we're doing here at Focus on Christ. Is for so long the church has just assumed if you read the Word you're going to get all the answers. And at Focus on Christ we understand that it takes a little bit more than that. This has to be a daily habit that we get into. And once we develop these really, really strong and good habits like the daily Bible reading and making sure you have a good prayer life, making sure you have a good connection with your brothers and sisters in Christ. Once we have a couple of those habits really well established, you'll find that life becomes a lot easier, and it's a lot easier to see God in everything and to recognize who and what He is. And so that's what, but the Pharisees here had done just the opposite. They were not as interested in pointing you towards God as they were interested in pointing you away from sin. And that's a completely different focus than what Christ came down to this earth with. Let's go over to Galatians chapter 2. So we're going to go over to Galatians chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 1 through 10. So Galatians 2, 1 through 10. Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also took Titus with me. And I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but previously to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty by which we had in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But from those who seemed to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seemed to be something added nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was for Peter, for he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me towards the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go up to the Gentiles, and they should be circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do. You can see here, this is an example of how people gain trust through integrity and through that solid ground. And he's going through the story here of so Paul's going through the story here about, he has the message to the Gentiles, and he's just going through how he built up some of that trust over time, how he was intent on working with these people again and again to ensure that the work that he was doing was not in vain. And so this is a great example of how we can build trust. And it goes through this issue with circumcision, where there were people coming in to undermine the church and the work that they were doing in the church, because they could see the benefits and the beauty of this church that was founded on Jesus Christ. And they came in and they were trying to undermine that and take that away. And then Paul just goes back in and he talks about the foundation and the strength and why they made the decision they did, and why and having those deep roots and that strong foundation, they didn't hear what these false teachers were saying. So it's a great example of how leaders can gain trust. We're going to go over to James chapter 1 real quick. This is a short passage. And James is the what I tend to call the practical Christianity. So this is James 1:22 through 26. Says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word but not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer but a doer of the works, this one will be blessed in what he does. If anyone among you thinks he is religious but does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless." This is talking a little bit about, it gives you some practical examples of be hearers, don't just be hearers but doers, and that execution and that action type of steps that leaders must take in order to be who they are. And then it says, if anyone amongst you thinks he is religious but does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. And that's what happens with hypocritical leaders. That's what happens when you violate trust, when you do things in your leadership daily walk that are incongruent with the good leadership principles and good leaders' activities and how you should be conducting yourself. You're going to find that your trust is deeply eroded, and that you're going to have, your people aren't going to respect you. So some of the things that you can look for when you're a leader to help you identify where you might have weaknesses is, in this particular case, if the law of solid ground is something that you might be struggling with, a lot of times this will show up with where your staff and your employees and your organization, the people in your organization, don't actually trust you. It's respect goes hand in hand here, but it's that they just really lack that trust, and a lot of times that will show up in sidebar conversations, water cooler talk. It'll show up I've used net performance score testing before, and it really shows up there. So what that is, if you're not familiar with it, is you send out an anonymous survey to your employees with a list of questions that are designed to get them to respond and to provide feedback on the leadership, the communication, the management of your organization. And these can be a great asset to you to help you identify blind spots, identify weaknesses, and areas that you need to improve in your organization. So really, really a cool thing. But that's how you can identify when you might have a challenge here with with respect or trust in your organization concerning the law of solid ground. So that was the law of solid ground from John C. Maxwell as looked at from a biblical perspective. And I love this law of solid ground. I say I love every single law, and I really, really do, and they are all my favorites because there's not a portion of your life that you live in your leadership walk that doesn't involve every single one of these in some high degree. And so I hope that what we've discussed here has been helpful to you and has kind of given you some insight and some biblical background for what that law looks like and why it's so important that we have that law in our life and in our leadership so well. So, like I said, I hope this added some value to you. Before we go, I just want to make sure that I talk to you about our Facebook page. If you haven't been over to our Facebook page yet, it's Focus on Christ. You should be able to just put that in the Facebook search and it'll pop right up. Same with Instagram. We're Focus on Christ on Instagram, and you should be able to find us on there. You can always get daily motivation and daily inspiration on there. And it's more about the inspiration than motivation. I don't really want you motivated. Motivation comes and goes. Inspiration reaches deep inside of you and pushes you forward into a new direction. And that's what I really want for you. I want your eyes on Christ every single day. And if I can help a little bit in getting that done, then that's really awesome. And I'm glad to be able to do that for you. The last thing I want to share with you is if you haven't subscribed to the Focus on Christ podcast, please go ahead and do so. It's out there. This is our 7th episode, and so there's 6 of them out there you can listen to, and it'll walk you through to where we are right now. And I hope that you enjoy those. Also, you can head on over to focusonchrist.com. On there, you're going to find resources and tools for your Christian walk. So if you haven't been over there already, I encourage you to do that and check that out. And there's always more coming. So stay tuned on our Facebook page. There's always a live coming out or a new post. And usually it's something to do with content or a new way to think of things, so that you can lean into that mission and vision that God has called you to. So I can't wait to talk to you guys next time. God bless.